when you're performing and when you're singing to an audience, your audience may not be musically sophisticated. In other words, they can't tell you what key it's in or what the notes are. They don't know anything about the mechanics of playing an instrument, but they know when they feel something. And that's the soul. That's the soul responding to these vibrations and responding to the honesty of what's being communicated. And that's super powerful.
Hello and welcome to Why Are We Talking About Rabbits Again? That's right, that's this podcast where we try not to talk about rabbits. Yeah, rabbits in this case aren't just rabbits, but they're things that go running around on the internet and reproducing so fast that you can't tell if they're actually real and you start to wonder, what the heck? Where am I? That's this podcast where we talk about heavy things lightly, right? We do this because, well, at First Things Foundations, what we try to do is offer some assistance, heavy stuff, lightly. Check us out at www.first-things.org. And also, keep coming on the podcast because we get people like we have on today, La Tanya Hall. You'll hear her bio in a minute, but let's just say she's pretty much made music with everybody you've ever listened to. So, La Tanya Hall today on episode 58. Just how old world is the jazz world? La Tanya Hall on Watar. Welcome to Watar, and I'm here today with La Tanya Hall. La Tanya, you're going to do something we haven't done, which is we're going to move it all the way into music and talk about the old world and the new world in music and try to wind in some of our work, but most of all, like, download your expertise and all your background in music. So I want to tell people out there what you're doing. So can I read a little bit of your bio to introduce folks to you, and then you can add or subtract as you wish. Okay. This is La Tanya Hall, guys. Really a beautiful, wonderful musician. She's also a teacher in lots of places. So she has worked with folks like Steely Dan, Diana Ross, Bobby McFerrin, Michael McDonald, Quincy Jones. I read Quincy Jones and I said, yeah, we're blessed to have you on, among other people. Patti LaBelle, Aretha Franklin. So La Tanya is a vocalist, right, La Tanya? But as a musician, you probably do all kinds of stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, I mainly live my life as a singer and musician. Right. So, I mean, I play piano as well, but that's not, I basically consider myself a singer. That's the main thing.
You've done solo as a solo artist. You've worked with the American Composers Orchestra, Denver Symphony, St. Louis Symphony. You have an album out in 2020, which was named one of the top vocal albums of the year. But then you're a teacher. You've worked at the Stimmen Festival in Basel, Switzerland. That's a famous place. You've worked on the Great American Songbook, which is amazing. And you created the first vocal jazz degree at Oberlin Conservatory in Ohio, which is how I got to know you because my daughter attended there.
One of my first classes of students.
It's true, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I could keep going, guys, out there, but she's appeared on Broadway, was in The Sopranos, Cotton Club Parade with Wynton Marsalis. So we have an expert in jazz and a musician and an artist. And thank you for coming on. How you doing?
Thank you. I'm good. I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I certainly have, lived this music for a very long time and done a lot of research about this music. So I'm happy to share what I do now.
Well, one of the things that happens when we bring people on is we try to, the construct is the new world and the old world. And so the reason we do that, and you and I have spoken, is because we run a nonprofit that places people usually in old world situations. And so for people listening who may be new, and what happens is, La Tanya, when folks like yourself come on, we get new listeners, which is great. Thank you. What the old world is sort of pre-Enlightenment Europe, pre-1700s, sort of the rational revolution that led to kind of a pretty neat space called America, but there's some drawbacks. And so the old world is where I just returned from, for example, Mozambique, where people are living very simple ways, but in beautiful ways. And then the new world is people living in beautiful ways, but also in less simple ways. And so what I want to do today with you is just talk about jazz and music, because I think jazz is doing a bridge of some sort. And I want you to disabuse me of that if I'm wrong. But what do you think jazz is when you sit there and teach it and practice it? And what is it to you?
To me, jazz embodies everything about music. So you have to go back. You're talking a lot about the old world and the new world, but when you go back to the roots of jazz, its roots are in Africa, right? And the music from Africa is millennia old. And it's certainly, I always talk about the voice being, let's talk about jazz voice or just voice.
Yeah, please,
the voice was the original instrument, right?
Right.
So it's been a means of fellowship. It's been a means of communication since time began. And so when I listen to jazz, I hear all the elements of that. And I hear all the elements of the rhythmic components, which were used to mimic language, which are still such a vital part of African music and African understanding. So for me, I hear the ancients and I hear the ancient voices when I listen to jazz music.
Do you think people who you perform with and work with and teach with, do they hear it that way? Because the people now realize I'm not, I'm a listener. I don't produce music or make music. Somehow jazz is in the mind of Americans, I think, is new or something like fancy schmancy new. Do people, am I onto something there or not really?
Well, I mean, technically the creation of the jazz era was in the early 20th century, right? So it started with ragtime and blues and like 1910 to 1920. And then in the 1920s, you started to really have the onset of what we now call jazz. So I mean, I guess if you want to compare it with the beginning of time, of course, it's something that's new. But as I said, I think its roots are ancient. And you can hear it. You can hear it in the music. You could actually take some tribal music that's been passed on for centuries and centuries and centuries to people, and you can find elements of that, especially when you look at the rhythmic component of jazz. You can hear that in the music that's being played today. So,
okay, can you expand on that a little? The rhythmic component.
Well, I mean, then we get into the discussion of music in general, right? And so, when you look at jazz is rooted in rhythm. And when you look at like European Western classical music, that's rooted in harmony. And so the rhythm is what drives the jazz. And there are definitely harmonic components to it, right? And sometimes very complex harmonic components, but it's very rooted in the rhythm of the music, which comes from the rhythm of language.
Right.
That's why what I talk about, that's the biggest difference to me between jazz and Western European classical music or Western European music.
So in Mali, where I did a lot of my work that led to this First Things journey that we're on, the nonprofit, Mali introduced me to the griot. And the griot, I mean, you probably know all this, and I want you to expand on this, because the griot would come to our village about every 6 months, and he would bring his band. Now, these guys were really intense, and they did 3 days of storytelling. And you're right. Most of it that's right. He was speaking, it was through the narrative, and the narrative was rhythmic. It was a type of rap, right? It was a type of conversation. So is it because of that storytelling heritage? Is that's what you're tying to the ancient world? Is that griot heritage? Does that come into play?
Well, it's the storytelling aspects of it, but it's also the musical aspects of it, and it's how the music and how the storytelling is told.
Mhm.
So these stories that the griot is telling are stories that have been passed on through centuries of time, right? From griot to
That's right.
community to community. And when we talk about the ways in which people learn music, 90% of the world is learning through the oral tradition.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So the whole construct of musical theory, and especially musical theory that's rooted in Western European harmonic construct, it's very different from how people learn around the world. Very, very different. And sometimes it's held up as the gold standard. And I'm a huge lover of classical music and a huge lover of classical harmony, but we also have to give credence to the different ways that people learn music and the different ways that people understand music. And the way that it's been taught, when we talk about these, the oral tradition of passing things on, really allows for an expansiveness to the music and an expansiveness to how music is created. It allows for improvisation. It allows for spontaneous creation. And that, to me, is the beauty of the music.
So like I said, I was in Mozambique, and we went through, it was a museum, and it was really a museum to the town called the Ilha de Mozambique. It's the Isle of Mozambique, where the Portuguese first arrived. And so it was a Portuguese institution that had been created, and then the Mozambicans had taken it and turned it into a museum. And there was all this European history. So I got to, 20 minutes into the tour, really, really nice guy, doing a really good job. And then I asked him about the Makua people. And so the Makua people are the people that were met by these boats. And they were the African people that were met by the Portuguese and the Dutch, the ones that had the land. And I said, let's talk about their history. And it's interesting what you just said. He said, we can, and I will. But then he himself, a Mozambican, said, but I want you to know these aren't backed up with any historical facts. And it was really interesting because he's talking to a European guy, or at least an American of European descent, right? And I already knew the answer, the one that you just gave, is that there's truth in the narrative, regardless if it's sort of been westernized through the written word. Everything was written, suddenly we trust it. And I wanted him to go deeper, but he had been trained in his own way to not trust his own narrative. It was really interesting. And we later on would discuss, and I really wanted more information about the Makua people, but because it hadn't been written down, somehow it wasn't held in high esteem. But jazz is doing something like holding on to the tradition, despite the fact that, as my daughter always tells me, Papa, not everything's written down that I'm playing. And I always want to try to figure, point me what you're doing. And she's, I can't always point you to what I'm doing because a lot of it is not written. Does that describe jazz as maintaining a narrative that may not be westernized in that way? Does that make sense to you?
Well, I think some of the framework, a lot of the framework is Western, right? Is rooted in that Western theory. But what's the beauty of jazz is that that framework allows for all kinds of creation within it.
Right.
So, my husband is an incredible improviser. He's a jazz pianist. He's won a couple of Juno Awards, which is like a Canadian Grammy here lately. I'm bragging on him a little bit.
Good. Do it. Love it.
But the reason, what I love about him is he will never play anything the same way twice. And it's not that he's trying to be, special or to show off what he's doing, but that's the nature of the music, and that's how he was rooted in the music, and that's how he learned to play with. He studied at the feet of Oscar Peterson, right? And he learned to really be free in the process of creating the music, and to let the music flow through him. And that's one of the things that I love about jazz. And that's one of the things that I think makes for a successful jazz musician, and also a jazz musician that makes me feel something, is when they actually allow the music to channel through them.
Would you call that a type of individualism?
Sure.
Do you think, is that a predicate of jazz? Must there be sort of a concept of the individual as free? Because in the old world, often you didn't have the modern day idea of the individual is really different than the old world. Do you think that individualism in that sense is necessary for jazz? Again, I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think there's individualism within improvisation, but the roots of jazz are in collaboration.
Yes, that's right.
And so, we have to. It's collaboration, and it's really deep, responsive listening, which is something I talk a lot about with my students. Right? Is that you must when you're making music, and especially when you're making jazz music, you must always be in the moment, and you must always be open and listening, and ready to respond to what is happening around you. So while you may have an individual take within the confines of where you are improvising, it's also an extreme form of collaboration.
Right. An extreme form of listening.
Yeah.
I love that. I think one of the things we've lost in the modern world is the notion that maybe everything is done in a dynamic relationship with in some ways, the idea of the individual is a lie, right? I mean, we won't attack the concept because it creates a lot of freedom, but I'm not really free to do anything vis-a-vis my society unless I'm paying attention to the people that whatever I choose to do as an individual will impact someone else. And so jazz, while I like it, it's sort of it's the paradox, which is it's both individual, but it's impossible that it takes place at an individual level. There has to be dynamic relationship. Does that make it really important who you play with? I guess it matters, right?
I mean, yeah. It's like any relationship. There's you can have different kinds of chemistry with different musicians, and that's something that I certainly take into consideration when I'm doing a record, or if I'm putting together a band, especially if it's a band that I'm going to be working with doing any kind of touring, right? The chemistry is everything. So in some ways, there could be somebody who's more of a virtuoso, as a pianist, or a virtuoso as a horn player or a guitar player or a drummer. But if the chemistry isn't happening, then we're not going to make great music together.
Would that be the same for a big giant orchestra of 60 people? It feels different, but maybe.
I don't know if I can necessarily speak to that, because I've sung with orchestras, but I've never played in an orchestra. Right. I just know that, I did study opera for a while, and I used to fight with my teacher in my first year of college a lot, because I had come from the world of jazz. My father was a jazz pianist and my mother was a singer. So I was used to sort of making things my own a little bit, while I was doing it. And I would be singing an aria and I would add a trill here, or I would sort of reinterpret a line. And, my teacher was like, no. And, you have to sing what's on the page. And I was really wedded to all the indications that were on the page, the dynamics, the pronunciation, the language, the notes, the phrasing, where I would breathe, was dictated. And that's not to say that people can't have an individualistic approach to how they do it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have these masters of classical music who really bring something unique and different to it that really makes it come alive. Right. So there is a sense of individualism that comes to it. But I think that the framework is much more dictated. It's it's something that must be followed.
So as jazz gets formed up, again, I'm referencing someone named Georgia here, folks who are listening. That's my kid who studied under La Tanya.
And so I have to say, she is a phenomenal. That girl she's a wonderful singer, wonderful interpreter.
I have to tell you, I'm going to get in trouble because my wife is like, don't do that. Don't bring it up. It's too late. Forgive me, guys. So check it out. La Tanya, we were watching a documentary together. It was The Birth of Jazz, I think, on PBS. It was fantastic. I wish I could remember the exact name.
Was it Ken Burns? The Ken Burns?
It was the Ken Burns. There was the Ken Burns documentary. Yeah. And it, I think Ken Burns was trying to say something about the foundations, and it was definitely a conversation about black and white. But I was surprised by the degree to which whatever European music is, and you can set me straight on this, how it played a role, and then was sort of how it played a role in stealing away a lot of the creativity from early black musicians. Maybe you can speak to that.
Well, appropriation is something that's been around for a very long time.
Yes, it has.
But I want to make no mistake about what I'm going to say. Jazz is wholly an African-American art form.
Yeah.
It was created by African-American musicians, period. And it's not to say that there have been, wonderful wonderful European makers of jazz and creators of jazz, and there continues to be. And I believe that music is a universal, and people should be allowed to play the music that speaks to their soul and speaks to their spirit. But we also we have to give credit where credit is due, and it is an African American art form.
Yeah.
And the music has been taken and claimed. In some cases, I believe unfairly. Mm-hmm. Even when you look at like rock and roll, and they put Elvis as the king of rock and roll, and they talk about the Beatles, started a musical revolution, but they were studying, Big Mama Thornton.
Yeah.
And Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who, when you look back at old videotape of Sister Rosetta Tharpe playing the guitar, the lick she's playing, the way she was moving across the stage, you're seeing Elvis.
Yeah.
Right? When you listen to Big Mama Thornton sing Hound Dog, and then you hear Elvis sing Hound Dog, you understand where he got a lot of that music from, right? But that was something that was never talked about. We have to give credit where credit is due.
That's right. Is the failure? So what happens, right? Elvis gets lifted up because he can sell to a wide audience. Is the failure in Elvis not demanding that people hear where he got this from? Is the failure in the machine that creates the pop artist? It's obviously a type of racism. Where is the failure lie for you as sort of a jazz knower, a jazz historian?
I just think it's a systemic thing.
Yeah.
It's a systemic thing. And I had, in Elvis's defense, he did talk about what some of his origins were, and mm-hmm. he wasn't afraid to say, I learned this from Black people. Mm-hmm. Right. And the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and those folks have also talked about who some of their influences were, and just hearing this music for the first time and getting really excited about how it made them feel and how they wanted to sort of recreate this. So we have to give them that. But the machine itself didn't talk much about it.
No. Right.
And certainly never corrected when people were saying, oh, they created this. That was never corrected, and it's never been corrected historically. But it's, for me, and this is something I talk about with my students, you have to know where the music comes from. You have to understand the roots of the music. You have to understand what influenced all of these people.
Okay, so stretch it out for me. I'll just be I'll be the counter. But why? Why can't it just touch my soul? Because one of the things I wanted to talk about is the soul and how the soul is being affected by music. Why do I got to know? Can I just enjoy it in my room? And why do I got to know?
I think as a casual listener, you can, right? And in other words, I don't want every person who's listening to music to have to go to school to figure out, mm-hmm. The roots of the song or where it came from or who did it originally and all that stuff. But if you're going to make music, if you're going to create music, and especially if you're going to create music out of music that's already been written and already been done, then learn where it comes from. And that to me has nothing to do with race. It's just has to do with paying respect to the art.
Yeah. Yeah. Listen, again, that griot guy, the griots that would come to the village in Southwest Mali, I'm telling you, they would start the morning. So they would start, it was like a party. It's hard to explain, but the party would start with him saying, and from Shaka, I received from Jomagan, and then he received from, and they spent the first, it felt like the whole day almost, telling them about who had come before. And it was fascinating. And that you can also find in all types of traditions pre-Enlightenment, which was it was incumbent upon the narrator to explain from where he was getting this information. And it was a way to say he's in alignment, he's in orthros, he's straight, he's speaking straight about about music or whatever it is he's talking about, usually history. Yeah. And so I guess as the maker of the music, it's incumbent upon you, but not everybody sees it that way. Or what happens is, is it some sort of inherent racism? What happens to us?
I don't think it's not, I mean, I'm not going to call it inherent racism. I'm just going to call it sometimes laziness.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think it's a malicious thing or a narcissistic thing always. It's just we hear a tune, we like it, we want to learn it, we want to learn how to sing it. It's something that moves us, right? But then we don't take the time, one, to understand what the composer intended by actually looking at a piece of music, right? Mm-hmm. And two, understanding where the song came from. I was like that when I was young.
Sure.
I mean, in my 20s, if I liked a tune, I just learned a tune and I sang it. But then what I realized in my later years, and especially when I started teaching, is that the more you understand the roots of the song, it changes how you interpret the tune.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It changes how you feel it, how you hear it, how you see it. And so as creators, we owe that. I talk a lot about being in service of the art and not in service of the ego. Right. And what I find, especially in the music business, is a lot that's in service of the ego.
Yeah.
And this is probably going to start touching on some of the things that you wanted to talk about with the soul.
Yeah.
Right. But in order for us to be good musicians, you have to be a great musician, you have to be vulnerable.
Right.
And vulnerability is the suspension of ego. Right. It's really allowing someone to come into your world and bearing your soul. And that to me is great music.
I have to explain something that's happening to me as you're speaking. I think the actual act of living a beautiful life is what you just described, because you can put this into a teacher-student relationship. I mean, our guys overseas, one of the things we're trying to do is we're not in service to our idea of what a good project is. The aid world jumps in on a impoverished community by offering them something that they already have, meaning that the aid world already has acquired, which is some sort of wealth or technology or something. And they jump in order to help that they may be made in their image. It's very interesting. Now, this hasn't always happened, don't get me wrong. And the end job is to get that Mozambican or West African to understand what's being given, right? And you said something really interesting. So the soul in that case, the soul of the individual who's receiving, it's a fascinating thing. That soul is not being attended to. What's being attended to is my ego and the delivery of my project so that you might become better. There's no introspection to that.
But by whose definition of better?
Exactly.
That's the interesting question.
Yeah, that's the problem, right? And so it feels like you described a musician's life that is actually the life of someone, the life well led. Perhaps you're describing how we should live to not only make good music, but also to make a good life. But it's hard. Aren't we taught to value what we think? You know what I mean? Aren't we taught to value, what's right about the way I think? Sorry, we're getting philosophical, but why not?
Well, here's the thing, and in particular about American culture, which I find quite fascinating, and I think is a big part of why we have such a divide in this country right now. We are a land of absolutes.
Mm,
So, in order for me to be right, you have to be wrong.
yeah.
Right? There's no shades of gray. So, what I think has to be the right way to think, and you may think a different way. Ergo, your way is wrong. Right. So there's no actually sharing of thoughts and ideas and sharing of different ways of seeing things. I don't have to agree with you 100%, but I do have to respect that you think differently than I do. And there's a part of me that really loves, I mean, we're supposed to be rooted in that, in the philosophy of this country,
Right.
but it doesn't quite operate that way.
There's definitely a disintegration in the, I mean, I've got questions for you here, sister, but I would attribute it to a breakdown in the notion that there's a soul. If I start to look at you as a machine, now we can get into the definition of what a soul is. We can talk about God or whatever, but if I start to see you as a machine or as a series of atoms to manipulate in order to get what I need, boy, what a nightmare that is. But if I see you as sharing literally something ephemeral, something eternal with me, don't I have to stop for a second? I think I have to stop for a second. Otherwise, I kind of put myself in danger. You see what happens? It's very interesting. So the soul, so let's do this in music. So let's say we all have one of these things called the soul. Music is probably the only thing I think right now in our crazy country that's so divided that I think everybody at a dinner table would say, yeah, music touches the soul. So what's it doing? Why does it do that? And why can everyone agree on that? What is it? What's going on from what you can tell? And who knows, right? But what do you think?
Well, I think it goes back to something I talked about, like right when we started talking with each other about the voice and music. The voice, especially, is the original instrument. So before instruments were created, music making was done with the body. It was done with the voice, and it was done with sound. But the vibrations and the resonance of music, it changes our insides. It changes our frequencies in our body. It changes the wavelengths in the brain when we hear music that resonates with us.
Wow.
It changes us physically. And so there's a great power to music. And I think sometimes it's completely indescribable. How many times I've always said to my students, when you're performing and when you're singing to an audience, your audience may not be musically sophisticated. In other words, they can't tell you what key it's in or what the notes are. They don't know anything about the mechanics of playing an instrument, but they know when they feel something. Mm-hmm. And that's the soul. Mm-hmm. That's the soul responding to these vibrations and responding to the honesty of what's being communicated. And that's super powerful.
Do you think some music is more soulful than others in that sense? Can do
well? I mean,
touch.
Listen, there's no way that I will know how anyone will respond to how a piece of music is played. So this goes back to something else you talked about, the individualism, right? Mm-hmm. So different music will affect people differently, and we have to be open to that. That's why people like different people. Some people like country, some people like classical, some people like hip hop. It's all depends on what resonates with you. But there's great power in music. There's great power in how it can affect people, how it can galvanize people. When you look at protest songs, right, which really have the power to bring, thousands, sometimes millions of people together in a unified fashion. When you look at even funeral music, right, something that can really set the tone and set the music when you're celebrating rites and rituals. Music is a part of everything we do in our life. It's a part of weddings, funerals, parties, births. It's everything. It's part of everything in this life.
Do you think societies that drive music out, Now, don't hear that as actively. I don't know many people that say, I want to drive music out of society. But where we become bereft of music, do you think the society can actually get closer to degradation and degeneration? Do you think that happens?
I do. I believe that music is a universal.
Yeah, it's like a metaphysical reality, right? It's beyond our mind, yeah.
And it's a healer. It has great power.
So in some ways, is it crazy to think one way to heal a nation or to heal a people's is through music therapy, but we don't do that. It feels like we do the opposite. It feels like we get rid of music whenever we're having a collapse in a community. We tend to cut that budget first. What's that about? It's interesting.
Yeah, but I mean, but the arts goes on.
No, you guys keep going on. You will not. I love it. You will not die.
It breaks my heart that they cut it from. It breaks my heart that they cut. It's been music programs are being cut across the country. That really breaks my heart. But the music doesn't stop.
Yeah,
The children are still making music. There's nothing more joyous to me than seeing a bunch of children playing together and hearing them spontaneously create music.
And they just will. You're right. It's almost if it's what we say it is, a metaphysical reality. It's not like you're going to get rid of it.
Mm-mm.
In that
it will
sense.
never go away.
No.
So I worked with Bobby McFerrin for a long time, and we did something called Circle Songs, which is it's all improvisatory music. It's created in the moment, never to be recreated again. You really have to tap into that childlike sense of music making, right?
Yeah.
So we'd be on stage and he'd point to, me or anybody else in the group and say, sing something, right? And in that moment, I have to make something up.
Will you tell us right now, please? How does it work? First of all, you're nervous, or do you feel it? What happens to you in that moment? Come on, share it with us. I want to know this.
Okay, so here's a very funny story about when I started singing with Voicestra. So Voicestra is 12 voices.
Okay.
And as I said, everything is improvisatory. So when I got asked to go on the road with Bobby, I was actually subbing for Janice Siegel, who is one of the original singers of Manhattan Transfer. And Bobby's manager had said to me, don't worry about it. Bobby's not going to call on you to solo. You're subbing. You just go in, you get your feet wet and make some music and have some fun. And I was like, great. So first gig we did was in Poland. It was an outdoor festival. It was about 10,000 people. And we're all lined up and Bobby starts a song and he comes section to section, right? And gives us our lines to sing section by section. And first 3 songs, I'm hearing everything. I'm blending well with my singers. I'm starting to dance. I'm having fun. I'm getting into it with the crowd. About 5 songs in, he comes and he stands right in front of me and he puts his hand out and signals me to start something. And I was like, what? No.
Wow. It's your
and
first night.
My first night. And I literally said, no. Oh. I started shaking. Like when he came and stood in front of me, it was just the most nerve-wracking thing. Right. And he looked at me again and he put out his hand and I said, I can't. Right. And I remember he sort of touched me on my forearm and he said, trust. And he led me out to the front of the stage and I don't know what I sang.
Really?
I kind of blacked out in the moment,
Really?
But which is probably the best thing that could have happened because then I wasn't wrestling with the ego, right? I wasn't wrestling with, oh my God, what if I crack a note? What if I don't, do this? And I just let whatever was going to come through me. And what's beautiful about Bobby is that he never lets you fail. So even if you just start something very simply, he will begin to build something around it. So you always have this soft landing place. But the more that I ended up staying with the group for the next, decade.
That night though, when it was over, you did it. What are you thinking to yourself? And he must have been thankful. Like he must have said like, nice, like, well done or no, or just move about your business after that.
That's not Bob, Bobby was never one to go, oh, you did great. It kind of was what it was. He's a very spiritual person. I believe he's an angel that walks on this earth. There's something very, very, very special about him, and very, very special about how he creates and what he brings into the world. So yeah, but I mean, I knew because I kept working.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually.
That, I must have done something right, but it was like going to school every night. And that's what I was so grateful for.
Yeah. I guess music in that sense is soulful because in that night, it pulled something out of you that maybe you didn't think you had.
I
right?
didn't know I had it.
Yeah.
I honestly did. I was so terrified. But it was, it opened a new portal for me. And it opened a new portal for me as a singer and as an educator.
But why do you think some of us don't? Okay, here's a secret. I was going to church down in Florida. The parish where we went, this is all a cappella stuff in the Russian Orthodox tradition. So, and the parish where we went had just nightmarish, like not prayerful. Okay, La Tanya. And then my 4 girls, this is where Georgia first started singing, at least in something, organized. I was the choir director. Now, I didn't know how to read music. And then my 4 girls and I and my wife, they're all good on some level compared to me. I start to direct them. It was a nightmare. But no, I will say this. It wasn't a nightmare in its beauty. It became beautiful. But I'll tell you this. I used to hate Saturday nights because I had to prepare the music and I couldn't. And I would practice with them and they were like, that's wrong. That's wrong. I said, why don't y'all just do this? They wouldn't do it. So here's my point to you. I don't have that by nature. I don't know. Why is that? Why do some of us get it? Some of us, do we have a buried soul? Is there something wrong with my soul, La Tanya? Help me.
Well, no, I don't.
Why do some of us have this talent? Why do some of us have it and some of us don't? Something's wrong with me. Save me, La Tanya.
I honestly think that you could probably tap into it.
You think so?
I do.
You must have to tell students something like this as you teach, which is like, it's in there, even when it doesn't appear to be, right?
Yeah. I mean, well, let's take Georgie, for example, right?
Okay, here we go again.
I know, I'm talking about your daughter.
You did it. I didn't. That's fine.
She's pretty extraordinary. Listen, when Georgie first came into my program, she'd never sung jazz. So she had actually applied for the classical program at Oberlin, and they had turned her down, which is still mind-boggling to me. But when I heard that tone of her voice, I couldn't wait to work with her. But she had never improvised before. She had never done any of that. And within a year and a half, she had taken to it like a duck to water. And it was something that again hadn't been tapped into in her soul, but something that we opened a portal, right? Where that sort of expression really steered her in a completely different musical direction than what she had anticipated doing.
So it's in there. And that's what you would argue, right? Is that not all of us are going to achieve musical greatness or anything, but it's in there.
But it's in there. It's in there, and it can be tapped into.
Do this with me. Do this with me. I've got this question that I really want you to just take a little bit, and then I don't know. I could keep talking to you for a while. I like this, but this one's it's a nerdy question. So classical music isn't jazz music, and jazz music isn't R&B. And what's the difference? Why isn't one thing the other in the musical world? Is there something happening in jazz that you can teach us about that makes it what it is?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's rooted in rhythm and improvisation. But so you gave an interesting. You said jazz music isn't classical music, and jazz music isn't R&B. Well, jazz music kind of is R&B,
but not classical, right?
But classical music is rooted in harmony.
Harmony, so that the harmony makes it fundamentally different.
And listen, it's beautiful music. It's beautiful music, but it's just different approaches.
So you would say jazz and R&B, they're not the same thing though, right?
They're not the same thing, but they come from the same mother.
What does R&B do? Does it turn something down while jazz is turning something up? I mean, how do we know the difference?
Well, jazz or R&B tends to be, again, groove based. So, and a groove can be quite repetitive, but again, it's coming from the same mother. So let's talk a little bit about the evolution of Black American music.
Yeah, do this. So
when we talk about work songs, right, which were rooted in slavery. So when slaves were brought over and they came from all of these different countries, they were stripped of their language, stripped of their culture, stripped of their identity, stripped of their freedom, right? And stripped of their name. But the one thing that they could not take away from them and the one place where they could fully express themselves was through music.
Yeah.
Right? That was the one. So when they were working in the fields, they started to sing field hollers, right? Which were tunes that would help them pass the time, but it was also a way of communicating. And it was a way that they could communicate without the massa, without the slave owners knowing what they're communicating about. And then that evolved into work songs. And then that evolved into hymns and spirituals. And then that evolved into gospel music, into ragtime and blues, into jazz, into rock and roll, into R&B, into hip hop, into neo soul. So there's a lineage. And that's why I say when it all comes from the same mother, it's because it was all evolving out of the same thing. Right. So it's just a different offshoot in that family tree.
Yeah. In that way, the origins are very old world, because those Africans that came in the 16, 17, 1800s, that's old world. That's not Enlightenment stuff. Don't hear Enlightenment when on this show. Enlightenment isn't like being smart or something. It's just a time period in history, because I think a lot of people get confused about how the history works. The Enlightenment was an actual, in my humble opinion, it was a very arrogant move on a lot of the European philosophers to start calling themselves right about stuff. I mean, if you want to boil it all down. But the Africans coming from Mozambique, for example, were not bringing that philosophy. I see. And so then it's really in the antebellum period, out of the field, that comes that rhythmic narrative that you keep talking about. But again, it's not Scottish, banjo music, but the banjo becomes a part of jazz. Is that right? Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, but the banjo is an African instrument.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm trying to think of something that's exclusively European. I don't know my music history very well. I guess it would be maybe like an organ. That was definitely invented in Europe. Mm-hmm. Trying to think. You're right. Almost all American music in that sense has that jazz rhythm feel. Is there something outside of jazz? Help me out here. What is it that's not jazz? You're going to claim it all. I like it.
But we're not claiming it all. The only thing that when we talk a lot about this, and I talk about the differences between the music, not to claim superiority of one over the other. Sure. But what I think we're asking about Black American music, and this is what is most interesting for me, is how it's, in some ways, it's seen as less than, right? Or it's exoticized. Right. And that's what I just can't abide, because this music is extremely complicated in some senses. It's not this. They almost infantilize it a little bit. This African music is so simplistic in its origins. You hear an ethnomusicologist talk about it in certain ways, and it just.
But that's not true.
And it's not. It's absolutely not true. And so when I talk about these differences, it's not to place one above the other. We're asking for a seat at the table. Yeah. In terms of recognizing the beauty, the artistry, and the merits of this music.
Yeah. Can you just do one thing for me? Will you just tell me what reggae is to you? Because I happen to be the massive most. Right now, my family's. Oh my gosh. Oh, there's a tornado warning.
Oh,
that was
no.
Interesting. Yeah. How about that? So, are we safe here, Andrew? Leave the tornado warning in, right? Maybe it has something to do with this podcast. I don't know. Let's see. Hopefully, I won't tear up the end of the podcast with my quiz.
To save me from flunking this quiz.
That's what it is. La Tanya will not take this quiz. No, you got to take it. It's fun, I promise. But before I do, my whole family and just everybody knows me. I can't get free of really the roots reggae. The whole culture is very interesting to me. I listen to it almost exclusively. Is that out of that's definitely out of that jazz sort of origins, right?
It's out of the, it's definitely its origins are in Africa for sure.
It's the African origins, yeah.
But I mean, I love reggae music, but honestly, I could not speak with any specificity.
Okay,
on
fair enough.
Yeah.
It's not outside by any means. Well, it's definitely, African. Yeah, I got something happened to me. I got colonized by those cats. I love it. I'm happy to be too. Okay, so here's the quiz, and it's kind of fun because my girls took it too on this show. So it's called the Lightometer. And so what it's trying to do, I figured about 10 episodes in, is people were like, what do you mean old world, new world? So it's 5 questions meant to sort of figure out, okay, are you more old world or are you more new world?
Okay.
And so they're goofy questions, but they work, La Tanya. I really find that people are like, yeah, that's pretty accurate. So you ready? We're going to take it. We've reached the end of this. By the way, we joke, this is a scientific, this is true in the truest materialistic sense. So here is your number. 3 plus 1 is 4 plus 2 is 6 plus 1 is 7 plus 2 is 9. Would you like to know what this qualifies you as? Okay.
Can't wait to hear.
You are the suburbanite. You feel romantic about the old world, but hierarchy is a word that you'd rather read about in a book. It feels like you should want to obey your elders a lot more than you actually do. And the individual is not more important than the group, except, well, sometimes you feel more important than lots of dumb groups that you get associated with. So that's the suburban. How does that feel?
That kind of feels almost spot on, like very, very close.
I think most.
I like this quiz.
Yes. I love that you love it because I always get nervous. We give it to most of the guests and people leave saying, oh, I never thought about that. I'm also a suburban. I'm a high suburbanite. So you scored 9. I think I scored a 9 too. I have to take it again. So, every time I travel, I come home because I'm in some wacky places and then I come home and I'm so thankful that I'm an American. And then I also think how crazy it is here. And if I go to Walmart one more time, I'm just going to go crazy. It's not my favorite place. And so I'm torn. And I think that's what that is. So, all right, you're lovely. I don't want to get all cheesy, but you're a pretty important person in our lives in this family. And on this pod, you've done a really good job of helping people to hear about music and this concept as we wrestle with whatever world we're in right now. It's nice to hear people talk about some beautiful things like music. So,
well, thank you so much for having me on. This has been a joyous hour. Enjoyed talking with you.
And you gave a lot of joy. I thank you. I mean it. Look at you. Your face is just filled with joy. So if you can't see her, guys, and you're listening on the pod, if you're listening on the audio, then go over to the YouTube channel. So thank you, sister. I'll be in touch. And you'll be hearing from my kid as she tries to navigate Juilliard and figure out.
I'm gonna see your kid next week when I'm in New York.
Oh, is it just next week? That's right. All right, take care of her. We whatever it needs, she'll be fine. But all right, thank you. I'll see you. All right,
take care.
God bless. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Well, that was La Tanya. By the way, you can find La Tanya at www.latanyahall.com. You can find it in our pod notes. You can get her music and you can learn about her most brilliant career Sheni's Gagi Marjos, that means to you the victory that's often said at the KP table in Georgia. We have a KP journey going on right now, even as I record this. We have 5 people on their way to go visit that fine country, even through the COVID curtain. Yep, that's our pod for today. That was La Tanya Hall. Thank you, La Tanya. You are a great guest, and we're a great guest, are a great person. Watar is produced by Andrew Schwark and Daniel Paternos. Our pod is brought to you by the creators of First Things Foundation. Yes, that's us. We send people into the field, some of the world's most isolated and forgotten neighborhoods, where we immerse to create momentum for local change makers, folks we call impresarios. We work on behalf of their idea. We don't import a project. We listen, and we create dynamic relationships that change lives. Share the Watar, that's this podcast, with friends. Hit us up with solid reviews on iTunes and everywhere you get your podcasts. Remember also, we're looking for field workers right now for West Africa. Your love for us allows us to love others. Nakvam dis, au revoir, hasta luego, kambufo, nawe. These are just some of the languages you can learn when you join First Things. And by the way, peace out.